Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
Welcome to today's podcast, the first in a series focused on the medical device industry. Today's podcast, best practices and recommendations for early to mid-stage medical device companies to implement design controls. We're going to cover a bunch of interesting topics, when and how to think about design controls, how your approach today may limit future opportunity and value in your intellectual property, and what to do when the game changes. My name is Bill Roth. I've spent the last 20 years in the entrepreneurial world, most notably with two successful software startups that led to acquisitions by larger players in their respective markets. I'm a current investor and advisor in the tech space, including the medical device industry. Thanks for listening in. Really excited to kick off today's podcast. I'm joined today by two industry veterans in the medical device community. First, we've got Mike Drews. He's president of Vascular Sciences and Education Training and Consulting firm servicing the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology industries. Mike holds a PhD in biomedical engineering, among other degrees, from Iowa State University. Mike is an internationally recognized expert and featured keynote speaker on cutting-edge medical technologies and regulatory affairs. Mike is also currently an adjunct professor of medicine, biomedical engineering, and biotechnology at several universities and medical schools. We're also joined by Jon Speer. Jon is co-founder and resident guru at greenlight.guru. Greenlight offers an innovative approach to EQMS through delivering a solution exclusively built for the medical device community, helping med device companies get their products to market faster with less risk and better patient outcomes. Jon is also co-founder and president of Creo Quality, a consultancy formed in 2006 to help support med device and life sciences startups with product development, project management, and broader operational needs. Jon comes at us here with more than 16 years of experience in the med device field. Jon has become known as an expert in FDA design controls and regulatory submissions such as 510K and CE technical files. Jon also recently authored and published The Ultimate Guide to Design Controls, which has been creating some very interesting buzz in the space. Mike and Jon, thanks for spending some time with us today. How are you guys doing?
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Glad to have you both here. We're in the spirit of kind of this fast-paced life that everybody lives into. Like to kind of jump right in. Mike, I want to throw a question over to you. Kind of a simple one. When should design controls begin?
Well, that's a great question, Bill, and thanks again to you and Jon and Greenlight for the opportunity to participate in this podcast discussion today. So when design control should begin is an interesting question because, like virtually all questions in regulatory affairs, the shortest and most succinct answer is it depends. And really, it can be thought of in a couple of different ways, from a mechanical perspective or from a philosophical perspective. So first, from a mechanical perspective, a strict read of the regulation says that the design controls are supposed to kick in upon project initiation. Now, one can define the word initiation in many different ways. For example, does that mean when you first come up with the idea for the medical device, early in R&D? That's typically not when most people start to think about design controls in a mechanistic perspective. But on the other hand, from a philosophical perspective, when you think of what design controls are really supposed to do, it's really, design controls is a synonym in my mind for what I call prudent engineering. And that is stuff that we really should be doing anyway, and the regulation reminds us that of what we should do, perhaps so that we don't forget something.
So, Jon, as far as Mike just shared, you kind of think about the art versus the science of a lot we do in business. What's your take on kind of this concept of project initiation?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, having worked on a number of projects throughout my career, I mean, I've seen a lot of different approaches, and Mike is exactly right. It does depend. But I think from a practical point of view, I think there's this fear about when I start design controls, that if I start it too soon, that somehow or another that it hampers my ability to make progress, or that I'm suddenly now under some extreme scrutiny from FDA or other regulatory bodies. And I think that that fear has caused a lot of debate and a lot of discussion on when design controls begin. I mean, to me, the way projects work, they're not linear. We don't go from one step to the next step to the next step in a straight line. That seldom, if ever, happens. So my vote would be, initiation. And project initiation, once you have a concept or an idea or some sort of user needs or some idea of what you're going to try to solve from a medical device perspective, to me, there's really no harm in starting design control at that point in time.
I guess from a layman's perspective, you guys obviously bring a lot more clarity to this subject. When we think about how design controls are perceived, you kind of think necessity for filing and audit readiness, or really more value add in kind of building a better product, or both. How do you balance the necessity of what some of these regulations that may be placed on us versus what's just right for getting the best product out the door?
Well, Bill, I'll chime in, and then John, you can follow on. First of all, let me just take a half a step back for a moment and just really echo one of the things that John just mentioned a moment ago, and that is that design controls in particular, or regulation in general, should not, absolutely not, hamper progress. And unfortunately, this is sort of contrarian to many people's view today, because they look at it as the more regulation or the earlier design controls are required to kick in, the more difficult it's going to be, the longer it's going to take to develop a device, the more expensive it's going to be, the higher the regulatory burden. And although I understand why a lot of people think that way, it does not have to be that way. This goes back to what I alluded to in my first comment, and that is design controls, in my mind, are really nothing more than prudent engineering. Perhaps I'm dating myself here, but just for the benefit of your audience, I started out in this business as an R&D engineer in the early 1990s, long before there was any design controls in place. And somehow, I don't know how this happened, but somehow we were able to get reasonably decent medical devices onto the market, even though we didn't have these thousands and thousands of pages of regulation. Today, we have all of this additional regulation, but the question is, are our products, are our devices really any better? I'll leave that as a rhetorical question, but it's an interesting question to ask. So bottom line, the best advice that I can give to the folks that are listening to this podcast is don't focus so much on the design controls from a regulatory sense. In other words, yes, I understand it's important to follow the regulation. It's important to make sure that we have the right documentation. It's important to make sure that we have traceability and all these different things. But more importantly, ask yourself as a prudent engineer, what makes sense? What are the things that I should be doing? And then consult the regulation and use the regulation as a backup, as a sanity check to make sure that you haven't forgotten anything.
Very, very, very good points there, Mike. John, any lasting thoughts here on this topic before we shift gears a little?
Yeah, I mean, prudent engineering, Mike's spot on. I mean, and I want to emphasize, again, I mentioned the fear. And I think there's this fear about regulation. There's this fear when engineers hear this term design control, that suddenly that it's some sort of complicated, convoluted thing that I struggle to understand. And I'm just going to say keep it simple. And keeping it simple and design control should just flow with how you're doing your prudent engineering. It should flow with the progression of an idea through the definition of requirements to testing whether or not that product meets those requirements, testing whether or not the product meets those user needs. And as long as you keep that continuum in mind, design control should be something that just happens as part of being a prudent engineer.
Some engineers are believed to stay in that, along the theme here, to stay in research for as long as possible, for the belief they can somewhat fly under the radar, I guess, before crossing over into development. Jon, I gather you have some strong opinions around what many refer to as making the transition from R to D. Just share a little bit about kind of what the industry is talking about here and why it really matters.
Sure. And so there's this long-standing belief that if I'm in research with my medical device product development effort, as long as I can say that I'm in a research mode, that somehow or another what I'm doing is outside the purview of FDA or other regulatory bodies. And if I'm inclined to believe that, then I may choose to stay in research for as long as possible. And it's interesting to see, some companies will be very adamant that, no, this project is research, and it stays in research until, we have a proven concept and a proven model, and we've done, an animal study, and after we've done that, then we kick over into development. And then, it kind of gets back to our earlier discussion about when design controls begin. Once I cross from research into development, then my design controls begin. And I think it's interesting, is that really a pragmatic or practical approach to this topic? Does it really matter if I'm in research versus development?
Mike, I'm sure you've got kind of maybe a similar, slightly different twist. What thoughts you have?
Well, thanks, Bill. I'll just pick up on Jon's very last comment, and I think it was very apropos, and that is, does it really matter if we say that we're in research or development? We could easily turn this discussion into a philosophical discussion of what the difference is between research and development. I don't want to do that. But more importantly, we should remember what Shakespeare said a very long time ago, and that is, a rose by any other name still smells as sweet. So in a big picture perspective, I really don't care, quite frankly, if we call it research or if we call it development. What's much more important to me is that we're doing the things that we're supposed to be doing. And hopefully the regulation will be echoing that. And even if you are working in early research, and let's be honest, unlike, for example, the pharma or the biotech industries, most medical device companies don't do very much R. They do a tremendous amount of D, but they don't do very much R. But even if you are working on the R side of research and development, you should, if for no other reason, be cognizant of design controls, because at some point, sooner or later, you or somebody in your organization is going to have to transition from research to development, which is definitely when design controls kick in, assuming that you're working on a Class 2 or a Class 3 medical device. And it's going to make that transition a lot easier to make. If you've thought about, pardon me, some of those sort of basic design control 101 issues, even though that technically, according to the regulation, they might not be applicable for you in research. And this is why, the software tools that you folks are developing, I think, really make it beneficial for customers, for companies to be thinking about those things, even in advance of maybe when they're required to do so.
Well, you both brought up the word transition, and I was actually just speaking to an early stage med device firm this week, and the topic surfaced of kind of how do you get a product from idea stage to something of significant value that a bigger player would want to scoop up, so to speak. So along this thread, Mike, how do you believe larger companies view a potential acquisition when there's little to no design control documentation?
Well, that's a great question, Bill. And as a part-time entrepreneur myself, someone who's involved in starting up several medical device companies, believe me, to quote a famous politician, I feel the pain of a lot of my fellow entrepreneurial colleagues, because when you're starting from nothing and you're building a prototype in your garage or your basement, you're trying to do everything sort of quick and dirty, and the last thing you want to be doing is spending a lot of time or money on regulatory minutia, shall we say. Nonetheless, in the context of design controls, I think it's important for even early entrepreneurs to understand that they can greatly maximize the attractability, if you will, of their little new startup to a potential acquisition, a large medical device company, for example, by at the very least having the beginnings of a design control system in place, or at least having the pieces of the puzzle in there, so that when the larger company acquires them or swallows them up, once again, it's going to make it that much easier for them to manage that transition. So my best advice for the entrepreneurs in this audience is, believe me, I understand you probably don't think this is very necessary. You probably don't think this is, a real good use of your time or your resources. But just remember two things. First of all, it will help you to be more attractive to a potential acquisition target. So that's sort of the pragmatic response. Perhaps even equally, if not more important, and that is from a philosophical perspective, going back to what we talked about before, design controls are really nothing more than what I call prudent engineering, what we're all supposed to learn in engineering school, although I'm not sure if they teach that anymore, doing the things that we really should do anyway. So those are my two best pieces of advice I can share for the entrepreneurs in the audience.
Jon, obviously you've got a pretty good breadth of client experience directly in the med device world. How have you seen either document controls being well documented, or simply void, play out in kind of the life cycle of some of these small early stage companies?
Yeah, it's a great question to consider, and I'm kind of playing a little bit on what Mike has said, but I'm going to come at it from a little bit of a different angle over the past several.
Yeah, and that's having that little different angle, Jon, is quite fine. In fact, one of the reasons why I was anxious to get you guys together here on today's cast is I recall a little bit of jousting back and forth over a couple of blog post comments, and it's great to hear both the similar as well as a little bit of the contrasting views that you guys have.
Sure. No, Mike and I. We enjoy the kind of the jousting from time to time. It makes each of us a little bit sharper. My different take on this, having worked with a number of early stage startup med device companies over the past 8-9 years or so. The early stage company, the startup, they're often driven behind funding, of course. They need to get some sort of funding to get their product to that next major milestone. And there was this trend that seemed to emerge, 10 years or so ago, certainly driven from the investment community, I think, that a major funding milestone was this thing called a 510K submission. Granted, that's for a Class 2 product, but startups in this space were just they glammed onto that because getting a 510K submission meant that it was a significant milestone that was directly attributed to their ability to get more funding. And I think that was one piece that really took hold in the industry. And another piece was this emphasis on intellectual property and getting patents and things of that nature. And I think that while regulatory submission and clearance are certainly important, significant milestones for any endeavor, especially for a medical device startup, and the same could be said about patents, I think there was so much emphasis that was placed on those two key pieces of the puzzle that design controls were abandoned. And I actually had a conversation with a startup yesterday, and they were successful. They got a 510K submission, and they've received their clearance, and they have no design history file, no design controls to speak of. They have done nothing on their quality system, and now they're interested in being an acquisition target. And suddenly they had one of those moments where they realized that they have a ton of work to do. That because they ignored design controls, because they ignored building a quality system, that they're not as attractive to a potential suitor. So, while that 510K is important, design controls, in my opinion, are just as important.
No, absolutely. And, simply put, I think we've all, in our professional and most likely our personal lives as well have had plenty of those oh crap moments where we kind of reflect back. We're going to wrap up today's podcast with sharing some insight on really how to manage up classification situations. So, for example, what we're talking about is a Class 1 shifting to a Class 2 or Class 2 making a bump to Class 3 and what's necessary in addressing design controls. I think some say it's really all about what you claim your device does. Others stress the importance of how additional bells and whistles may be added to your product design, change indications for use, and potentially how the FDA might view classification. Mike, what are your thoughts on this subject?
So, Bill, it's a very good question, and since I spend a fair amount of my time working as a regulatory consultant for a wide variety of medical device companies, I see it happen frequently where, as you described, the classification of a device will change. Sometimes it will be down-classified. Other times it will be up-classified. Sometimes the classification change is because of nothing that the company did. In other words, occasionally FDA will go back and reclassify devices prophylactically based on our experience with the device over a period of time. Other times the classification might change because, for example, we change the labeling. We go after a indication for the same device, but it has a higher risk, or we add an additional bell or feature that justifies the higher classification. So bottom line, because lower class products, most Class 1 devices are exempt from design controls in the regulatory sense, I see a lot of companies that say, well, we're working on a Class 1 device, therefore we don't have to worry about design controls. And if they find themselves in one of the scenarios that I just described, now they might be working on the same or similar device that's now Class 2, and all of a sudden they're in the wonderful world of design controls. So once again, I go back to what I talked about before. Whether technically you are responsible for following the design controls or not really shouldn't matter. It shouldn't be the most important thing that we think about. What should matter is that we have the systems in place that Jon was describing earlier, and that the software, the product that you guys have, it helps people to develop and to maintain. We have all of those systems in place, including quality and so on, so that if we're in one of those situations, it makes that transition much easier. And one last thing that I'll mention is I find a lot of the companies that I work with, they get so focused on bringing their current device onto the market that they really don't even think about the challenges for line extensions or new products that might arise, following that market. So, as Stephen Covey used to say, begin with the end in mind. So, yes, I certainly understand the pragmatic importance of putting most of our eggs in the current basket, that is, focusing most of our attention on the device that we're trying to get onto the market right now. But we should always have at least one eye to the future and be thinking about, what could change or what bells and whistles and features might we add, or what indication might we go after in the future that might kick us from the world where we don't have to worry about design controls very much to the world that we do.
Jon, Mike brought up an interesting theme around briefly on down classifications, which is something I really haven't thought about. Obviously, in an ideal world, keeping things as simple as possible would be probably preferred on the med device company side. What one single thought would you really want to hang your hat on when we're talking about either up or down classifications that you'd want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, one thought. Boy, that's putting me on the spot, Bill. Okay,
that's what it's all about, right? People want to be.
All right, so one thought. Your class doesn't matter. You have to look at design control is really a foundation. And I go back to early on in my career, sitting in an audit and going through. It was an ISO audit in this case, and we were going through design control, design history file with the auditor. And the auditor asked me a question, and I'm like, yeah, we did that. And the auditor was like, show me. And so basically, don't tell me, show me. And design controls is really what that's all about. I mean, Mike referenced a couple of times today prudent engineering. And if you're a prudent engineer, then design controls should be part and parcel with how you do your job. It's the proof, it's the evidence that your product does what you say it's going to do. And that should be irrespective of whether your product is Class 1, Class 2, Class 3, whether it's U.S., whether it's Europe, whether it's Canada. It really doesn't matter. Design control is a universal practice that allows you to prove that your product is safe and effective.
And at the end of the day, that's the game we're all in here, trying to make sure that we're bringing products to market as fast, as safe, and ultimately with the best patient outcomes. With that, Mike and Jon, thanks so much for spending time with us. Your insight obviously is interesting and definitely appreciated. Those of you listening in, thanks for your continued feedback and shared enthusiasm. If you'd like to stay in touch with Mike, you can check out more of what he has to say on his guest column at Medical Device Online magazine or connect with him on LinkedIn. You can check out more of Jon's writing at blog.greenlight.guru or ping Jon on LinkedIn. True to your roots. Till next time, let's all work together towards improving the quality of life on Earth and who knows, maybe even beyond.